Hello, everybody, and welcome to panel number 4, entitled Beyond Europe, Africa, New Wave Fashions. And we're very excited and honored to be here, part of FACE, the first summit in 2022. So thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to our 4 panelists. And just to start the introductions, my name is Dr. Erica de Greef. I'm the co-director of the African Fashion Research Institute. I'm a first-generation white South African. I have short brown hair with a little speckle of grey. And maybe just around the room, Nkumbu, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Nkumbu Mutambo and I am a researcher here at Northumbria University. I've recently handed in my PhD and so that's what I've been focusing on for the last few years. But in terms of my description, I am a brown woman with a brown scarf on and glasses.
And Nada?
Hi, my name is Nada Koreish. I am currently a lecturer at University West of England, UWE, on the Fashion Communications degree. I'm also the founder of Fashion Liberation Collective North Africa, and I'm doing my PhD. I'm involved in some other things, but self-description would be I am a North African brown female. I have ombre brown curly hair, which is just under my chin, and I usually wear some kind of bright coloured glasses.
Tolu?
Yes, hello everyone. Yes. My name is Tolulope Omoyele. In terms of description, I like red, and I'm wearing red lipstick, and I wear my hair short, which is a bit longer right now. And I am a doctoral student at London College of Fashion in my final year. And I'm happy to be here and to meet everyone.
Thank you. And Benita?
Well, hello, my name is Benita Odogwu-Atkinson, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University for the Creative Arts, and very much involved in the teaching of design and the remit within textiles as well. So both go hand in hand. And I have a very personal interest in fashion from the continent of Africa because of my heritage. I am a very brown person, middle parting, wavy hair, past my shoulders, and there, that's me.
Well, thank you so much. I need to apologize that Lesiba won't be able to join us right now, but he might be able to join us in a little later in the session. So, you know, I think as an introduction to the session, it's such an important conversation, and it's such an enormous continent that to try and sort of even grapple with not just the residues of fashion on the continent, but the residues of fashion beyond the continent. So I think really exciting work that all of you are sharing, and you know, I'm going to just really work through this program in, you know, in as little time as we have, but as exciting as the content is. So maybe I think Tolulope, maybe Tolu, if you would like to start, and then to I think you wanted to share your screen.
Sure.
And with a presentation called African Fashion Week London. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Can you see it? Can you see the screen? Yeah? Awesome. Okay, present. So it's clear, it's you can see it all clearly, right? All right, awesome. So like I said, my name is Tolulope Omoyele. I am in my final year at London College of Fashion, where I have been interrogating critically this notion of Africa Fashion Week in the diaspora setting. So the title of my presentation today is Africa Fashion Week, New York, Milan, Paris, London, and Lagos. And the reason for this title is because, I mean, since 2010, Africa Fashion Week, the concept has proliferated across capital cities in Europe and Asia and Americas as well. So just a bit of historical context to place all of this in context. The notion of Africa Fashion Week was first introduced in 2010 by a Nigerian American communication expert and founder of www.adire.com. Her name is Adiyat Disu. Adiyat said she attended the Arise Fashion Collective at New York Fashion Week in 2009. I talk about this later in another presentation I'm giving at the V&A next month. So she attended this Arise Fashion Collective, and where Arise sponsored 5 African-based fashion designers to present the collection at the Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week show. So she said she was there, Gracie Jones was there, all the black models came out. It was amazing and fascinating. And it all lasted for 15 minutes. So she said she got this idea. She got inspired by watching this fashion show on the mainstream catwalk at Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week to stage an African Fashion Week event centered on the creativity and the talent of African designers from the diaspora and from the continent. So when she hosted the first event in 2010, it was estimated that 70% of the people who attended, the designers, came from the continent of Africa. So she said, African fashion it's thriving, it's there. So the concepts proliferated across other fashion capital cities led by other African diaspora fashion practitioners and designers. You can find it in Milan, in Paris, in Berlin, in New Zealand. This notion of an African-centered fashion show and fashion week event. So the emergence of Africa Fashion Week concept is the result of a series of events. It's in response to, number one, the invisibility and underrepresentations of Black models that Bethany Hadison and Naomi Campbell have been talking about through balanced diversity, and also the lack of contribution or the negation of African fashion itself by the mainstream fashion industry. This is a picture of Adia Disu. I wanted to show the image of the woman herself behind this event, because sometimes you get to know a person's name, but you don't know what they look like. And I like this picture where she's used this poster or this picture, this image, in most of her advertising and promotional work that she's been doing. The caption is, "A man without culture is like a zebra without stripes." I like that. This is the first image from the Africa Fashion Week New York event in 2010. And I can recall when this image came out, everyone was like so excited. The first time I saw it on Facebook, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And the reason the amazement for me came from the fact that you see this brown skinned woman just relaxing on the Chase Lounge, and she embodied by nothing. She's just beautiful and she's glamorous. And the tagline for Africa Fashion Week New York is "Where Fashion Began." There's a whole series of commentary that can be made about that. But for my research on Africa Fashion Week, London, that's what the focus of my doctoral thesis is on, to examine cultural identities at Africa Fashion Week London. And what I found is quite fascinating because it brings issues. It raises a lot of issues surrounding, it's not external, like discrimination and racism, but it's more internal, like nationalism, cultural identities, and ethnic identities, and assertion of all this cultural heritage by the practitioners who attend the event. So Africa Fashion Week London was first conceptualized and introduced in 2011 by a Yoruba princess. Her name is Ronke Ademi-Louis. She's also a British Nigerian fashion entrepreneur. The event is described as providing a platform, an affordable platform for African and African-inspired fashion design talent. It's hailed as Europe's largest platform for African designers and fashion designers and enthusiasts who go there. Also, in 2015, a Nigerian version of Africa Fashion Week Nigeria was founded in Lagos, again by Princess Ronke Ademi-Louis. The event attracts a lot of dignitaries, celebrities, members of the royal class, politicians, fashion practitioners from within Nigerian industry. And you can find the same roll call of dignitaries at Africa Fashion Week London itself, because one of the patrons is called it's in English it's the king or the ruler, but in Yoruba it's the Oni of Ife, is the custodian of the Yoruba's culture and tradition. So he's the patron of this event, and he attends the event. And when it comes to the event, it's a whole lot of flamboyance and extravagance showcase. I also wanted to include this image of the dignitaries at Africa Fashion Week London. From the left is the Queen Dambisa of Congo. Next to her is the First Lady of Ekiti State, and she is also the Global Ambassador for Africa Fashion Week London and Nigeria. Next to her is the Erelu Bisi Fayemi. She's the First Lady of Kwara State, and she's the matron of Africa Fashion Week London and Nigeria. And then you have Ms. Folake Abdulrazak. And then the founder of Africa Fashion Week, Ronke Ademi-Louis, to the right. So one thing that I also found out about the event is I'm looking specifically at the Nigerian-ness of the event and the Nigerian, it's a Nigerian production, you know, by Nigerian diaspora. So the incorporation and inclusion of Nigerian-based governors' wives and first ladies, I'm critically interrogating that as well, to examine the narratives that they're producing. But I mean, ultimately, their presence at African Fashion Week London shows that these people are also tastemakers and influencers of Nigerian African fashion and Yoruba fashion and styles. So the impact of African Fashion Week London.
I'm just aware of the time, so I think we'd really love to spend more time, but I want to just move through the rest of the program as well. And I think just this introduction, I mean, just there's so much already that's really rich in terms of the kind of entry definitions of Nigerianness in this like continental and intercontinental space. So I don't know if you just want to wrap up your thoughts, or if we can just move on to Zambia, because we've got Zambia and then we've still got North Africa and a few others. Yes.
All right, so in conclusion, I also have several other images for some of the designers and what they're producing and showcasing at Africa Fashion Week London. So the impact of Africa Fashion Week London is it increases and amplifies the recognition of African fashion designers and tastemakers. It enables the voice and agency of so-called minority African fashion practitioners within the diaspora space, where they're taking back power by being proud of their culture and their heritage and their histories. And lastly, the collections presented on the catwalk at the event is not the stereotypical representations that you will find of African fashion. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tolu. And I think, I think that this troubling of the kind of expectations of what Nigerian fashion should be or could be, and the representations on catwalks, but also then in museums, I think is really, really topical and a really important one as well. But I think, I think we're staying with Nigeria a little bit longer, because I'd like to maybe just move on to Benita and Benita, I think you're sharing of quite a different conversation that is also about celebrating and acknowledging qualities that make Nigeria and Nigerian textiles so important. Maybe over to you. Thank you, Tolu, and over to you, Benita. Thank you.
Okay, hello. I think in terms of what I wanted to talk about was an aspect of the research I'm developing. And one aspect of this is textile pieces that really is about flags of identity. And for me, in the last couple of years, it's been very much, what is my identity? What are the aspects of my heritage and the diaspora I have been through that I really want to focus on? And I think that you can look at fashion from a superficial point of view, but what is also very strong about the emerging fashion from the continent of Africa is also a political voice, a powerful voice, a voice that actually wants to highlight things that have happened and why we are where we are. And I think that's really important. So the work I'm developing is very much about colonialism and, in my personal experience, crisis and a civil war, which all very much is from the aspect of impact of colonialism. Now, although I'm very much a fashion person, I wanted to look at a different starting point to then work towards a collection. So my initial thoughts were that in terms of recognizing and sort of storing and keeping the history of, there is a hierarchy. And the hierarchy always starts with the West first, and then everyone else comes after. So what I wanted to do was to start to focus on telling the stories that eventually will go into collections, but very much looking at the initial story. So for my research, it was really focused on the civil war in Nigeria, the Biafran civil war, which at some point I did experience because I was, we had to go back because my father was a diplomat, so we were all called back. So I just felt that that whole story sort of disappeared. And if we look at how things are recorded in terms of the bio-tapestry or the massive paintings on different civil war, where is all the things that have happened on our continent, which has been impacted by external forces? So what I wanted to do and what I'm starting to do is to find another way of telling that story and very much focusing on the aspect that I now do a bit more of, which is textiles. And as we know, and as Erica mentioned, the whole idea of textiles is super important to the continent. The variety, the skill, the development of. So in doing this work, I really want to capture a story that I want to tell. And it is the story of diaspora for so many people beyond the continent of Africa, because you're having people leaving war-torn areas all over. But I wanted this story to be memorialized. So it's really about saying that what comes from the continent has great value. The emergence of fashion is extremely important that it is actually being truly recognized, because as we know, when it has been, shall I say, borrowed, it was always heralded as, oh, what marvelous collections people have produced. And then when the people who own it are doing it, it's often dismissed, as has been a lot of the artwork and a lot of the bronzes, which were taken but then had great value when they were somewhere else. So this is our opportunity to say that we're not just emerging, we have always been there, but it's now the recognition. It's now saying, actually, that continent with the population of the youth in there, it's the blossoming of so much to come forward from that continent. The creativity, the style, the music, everything. So when we say emerging, it's about shouting out what is actually going on that continent. It's about memorializing. It's about actually giving the work that's coming from there the status it deserves. And for me, part of this work I'm doing is to actually say all of this is at the same level and more to everything else that's very Western centric. We have a lot to offer. And so I say that the emergence is something that I would say is going to come in greater numbers. The shift, I think, is happening and will happen. And I think that that recognition is partly what we need, but it is what's going to happen. Things are shifting. So the global and the Western world has to shift as well. It is now about being global in the good way, in that you truly recognize where things are coming from and not, sort of centered on one aspect of the world. And it is a big world. And the continent is rocking it. And that's it.
Thank you. And Benita, I think also maybe just the idea that it's having the courage to tell those tales. So in the work that you're doing with your textile work, really kind of bringing the personal into the narrative, because the personal is political, and as a creative force, I think takes an incredible amount of courage. But thank you for introducing us, and I think we'll come back to this as we kind of pass through the rest of the room. But maybe I would very briefly like just to welcome Lesiba who's joined us quickly. Maybe Lesiba, just a brief introduction, if you want to just introduce yourself, and a few words about AFRI or your role in the African Fashion Research Institute.
I hope there isn't any more issues. Yeah, we're currently experiencing load shedding in Midrand, Johannesburg, South Africa, which is where I'm from. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and fashion practitioner. I guess for the purpose of introduction, I'm also a Black male with dreadlocks, if you don't know what I'd look like. And I think essentially for us, for me, and in terms of the formation of the African Fashion Research Institute, the idea was, how do we create a space that considers fashion in a very critical manner, but fashion from the African continent? And how do we bridge the gaps that colonialism has kind of created between our societies or our civilizations, our cultures, but also how do we create a space that creates equal access, or strives to create equal access, and how do we do that through digital means? And I think for us, the digital was a very strong tool in being able to, one, collaborate with other like-minded individuals around the world. So not to kind of recreate the same sort of colonial tropes, ethnographic tropes, and try and, or rather be this conduit, the only conduit to kind of create knowledge on the continent where fashion is concerned. So yeah, that's basically it in a nutshell. I think maybe we should continue with the panel. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lesiba. Yeah, I think such an important this conversation amongst one another as researchers, to start to open up these conduits of conversation. And so for this panel, it's really exciting that we've got Nigeria, but we also have Zambia. So we're very welcoming to Nkumbu, and maybe you'd like to share with us your work.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen with you. And can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll just quickly run through a bit about my research. As I mentioned before, I'm a researcher here at Northumbria University. I've been doing my PhD for 3 years and in the process of wrapping everything up. So I'm just going to give you a whirlwind tour kind of on the work that I've been doing. And the title of the presentation is, of course, Heritage Beyond the Archive. Now, when I started my process of the PhD 3 years, and now 4 years actually ago, I would get into conversations, of course, with people asking me, so what are you doing? And I would tell them, oh, I'm trying to investigate the role and meaning of heritage in fashion design. And of course, I would be almost every single time sort of people would mention certain brands like Louis Vuitton, the Burberry or Chanel, and they would ask me, are you looking at these brands? Because those are heritage brands, aren't they? And I would invariably say, well, no, actually, I'm looking at fashion practices that don't necessarily fit into that model, in as much as that model it has value and, you know, whether financially or culturally has value. I was interested in looking at heritage within the context of African fashion practice. And I was really encouraged by this idea or this notion that's been put forth by many researchers, but Craig actually spoke about this very well in one of her works, and she talked about how the kind of elite fashion design system that emerges out of Western centers in Europe, for example, are not necessarily the determinant of all systems and shouldn't be. And that really encouraged me as I started my research, that even though everybody who I spoke to didn't seem to understand that heritage brands or heritage within fashion practice can exist in other contexts or in different ways rather than the ones that they were used to, it was still a valuable pursuit. And therefore, to kind of lead me on my research, I started to look at the actual term heritage and to interrogate what it means, really to drill down to what does the word heritage mean, because innately I could tell that I wasn't talking about the kind of archival brand stories that are typical of European brands, but I needed the language to be able to really articulate what heritage meant in a broader sense. And therefore, I really looked to the work of critical heritage theorists who've really, done a really good job of unpacking what that term means. And in that context, heritage has been really viewed rather as a negotiation of the past and for present purposes. It is not something that is object-based or particularly centered on specific materials or visual qualities. Rather, it's an intangible you could think of it as a tool or a practice that can be engaged with by different actors, whether actors who are in official spaces like an archive, a museum, or actors who are at a more ground level within a community or communities of practice. Now, the question that my research has been centered around is specifically around Zambia. And so I was asking Zambian designers how they made sense of heritage, just generally and specifically within their practice. And the method I chose for doing this, I thought was really important to not just look specifically at people's outputs or to look at their work and then try and interpolate an answer for myself. I thought it was really important to approach this question with a sensitivity to the context and the lived experiences of the people I was speaking to about their work. And therefore, I chose an approach called interpretive phenomenological analysis. And it's basically a method of inquiry that's centered really on understanding and interpreting what people are saying specifically about their work or about their life or about their experience, rather than trying to bring theory into the conversation before you even get into the room with people. And just to give some background for people about Zambia, Zambia is a very small country relatively with 17 million people. It has over 70 ethno-linguistic tribes or groups. And it is a former, I guess, administered territory. I think the UK was the main administrator of our land, and they formed this country, Zambia. It was a federation between what's now known as Zimbabwe and Malawi and Zambia. And in my conversations, I encountered designers from different backgrounds within Zambia, as well as designers who identified with the ethno-national identity of Zambia and outside of Zambia, so designers in the diaspora, essentially. These were designers who worked in very different ways. Some of them had a more traditional ready-to-wear approach. Some of them had, many of them actually, specifically in Zambia, had a very different approach to their practice, where they did make ready-to-wear garments, but most of their business was based off of one-off consultations with clients. So it's a very personal process in which they consult with the client to come up with the design. So it's a slightly different model, and that model is quite prevalent within Zambia. Now, some of the findings that I think are interesting to share today is around the concept of ownership. For Zambian designers, ownership was something that actually, interestingly, was very, nuanced for each person. There were designers who owned their work or owned the past that they were referencing, or the past that were present in their work or inspired their work at a very personal level. Some of them owned it at an ethno-national level. Some of them it was even a racialized level or a continental level. Another thing that I found interesting was when Zambians some Zambians seem to use their design practice specifically as a means of connecting themselves to their personal histories and stories and identities. And I think this kind of relates back to some of the conversation we've already been having, is the potential, the power that fashion design has for individual designers. Well, even if you look at their work, you might not be able to necessarily, in a quick moment, understand the story, but it is part of people's personal practices sometimes of even dealing with the sense of lack or disconnect that might exist because of their personal history. And that could be because of a disconnection to their heritage based off of migration, based off of conflict, or any other situation. But that was something that was interesting that came up in those discussions. And then also there was this notion, I think this is the biggest takeaway for me, is that the heritage value that's often associated with clothing in Zambian fashion design practice, it's often based on the use context of those garments or those items. So for a lot of designers, they don't necessarily always relate to the heritage value of the work they're producing, but as they're working with clients to produce garments for specific uses, specific contexts. For instance, in Zambia, there is a lot of practice related to various life stages, like marriage, for example. There is a particular, I guess, ceremony called the Chirangamulilo, and that ceremony has a lot of its there are a lot of cultural practices, meanings that are rehearsed or practiced in those spaces. So it was not necessarily the clothing itself that is heritage, but it was more the fact that the clothing in those spaces, on those bodies, it was a living practice of heritage. So I think the biggest takeaway for me in my research is to really reframe this idea of heritage and moving it away from the very object-based notion. And that's quite difficult because fashion design is essentially people are making garments that end up on physical bodies. However, I think a really important way of reframing the conversation about heritage and fashion, the fact that there can be different models of engaging with heritage beyond just the European luxury brand model, is to really disassociate the word heritage or the term heritage with objects, and to really bring it into conversation with the lived practices that people are engaging in, and how designers come in as almost interpreters of those cultural contexts, of those realities, and they materialize and manifest things within clothing that are used by people within their lives. And finally, just to wrap it all up, I really love this quote by Stuart Hall that I came across, and it's really this idea where he talks about heritage being a way in which a nation or a group of people, I would say, can construct for themselves a collective memory, just as families and individuals might construct their identities by storying or coming up with various random incidents and turning them into this cohesive story. I think I would like to leave this thought that designers, particularly fashion designers in African contexts like Zambia, are part of this ongoing process of storying their own communal identities, even their own personal identities.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nkumbu. Just such an incredibly important close reading, and I think so often we look at research on the continent as the entire continent, and this kind of close reading to a particular context gives such rich conversation. And I think this is also something that Nada, I think it's such an interesting segue straight into your work, where Nkumbu's starting point was beyond the archive, but in actual fact, you know, we're talking about repertoires, we're talking about values, we're talking about knowledges. And so Nada, I'm going to move straight over to your presentation, because I think it's ready for you to.
Thank you. I do have some slides for visual reference, so sorry they were a bit last minute, but if that's okay. So I use this visual reference a lot of the time. I'm Nada Koreish, by the way, because I find the juxtaposition, if you like, or the contrast between Oriental fantasy and the reality of things, and how that Oriental fantasy overtakes the reality. Really, really interesting. And a lot of my work is around, it really connects to everyone that's spoken in this beautiful way. And it just shows how connected we all are through the continent of Africa, but also through post-colonial identities and colonialism, and that idea of decolonizing through different methods. So my focus again is quite regional, surrounding North Africa, because I'm Egyptian and my husband is Algerian, so I focus a lot of my work around that. And because the region of North Africa, like many other regions, was colonized quite substantially for quite a long time by many different colonizers, and the lasting effect of that has continued through our fashion narrative. So these are just some of the things that I am involved in. I started the Fashion Liberation Collective for North Africa because of a need to address a lot of issues. Some of them, a lot of you amazing people have already touched on, but that idea of like Benita said, we've always been here. It's just celebrating our own heritage and being able to come to terms with our post-colonial identities and to embrace that and to create this hybrid fashion system. That is the goal of the Fashion Liberation Collective. It's designs for us, by us, but also for the rest of the world. So the idea would be, instead of fabulous designs inspired by Morocco, by Dior, for example, they are using Moroccan designers and they are celebrating them, maybe in a separate luxury brand. Because I think, as a lot of the presenters prior to me have touched upon, there are luxury fashion systems in Africa and all around the world, and they are their own satellite systems. They function extremely well, and they have their own set of rules. So by all means, the Western fashion system, in fact, when you look at it, does not dictate everything. It's just the most visible. So I guess the idea is, how do we make the next generation of designers more visible and give them those opportunities to embrace their identities? So this was just a little bit about me, and a little bit of some quotes that I've heard in the past, which have really added to this need to decolonize North African fashion and this idea to battle the stigma that Orientalism has created. I am currently focusing on my PhD research, which also focuses heavily about reclaiming and rewriting past histories, looking at Orientalism, looking at the idea of texts like, for example, by Edward Said, and how that is still very present in not just fashion, but in the way we carry and present ourselves. It also looks at the different effects of Orientalism and the different effects of that ideology on who we've become, and how imagery, not just in the way people are dressed, but imagery through art and design over the years, has created these false identities, and we have almost started to self-orientalize ourselves. So, for example, this was an image, kind of depicting the portrayal of Napoleon as the conquering hero in Egypt. That was the exact title of it in 1769. And I think you can see the massive, difference, not just in the position and posture, but of the clothing. You have the civilized West who are all wearing their military uniforms, a show of power. You then have almost like the barbaric Egyptians who are on the floor, they're barely clothed, and they have their spears and almost their very primitive, methods of defending themselves. And this took me down a road of looking at clothing and fashioning and colors in Oriental art and how the fantasy versus the reality. So this is just an example here. So for example, you have on the left, you have Rosati's The Harem Dance, which is depicting this very vibrant, harem with the well, if you will, the leader of the harem in the back, surrounded by all these beautiful women with all these different colors, etc. But then you have the reality of the harem, which is like in the Algerian Qasbah on the right, which is what it actually looked like. And there is a huge difference in clothing, in colors, in materials, in the stance, and there is not a man in sight. So to just wrap up what I am focusing on with the collective and my research, it is the idea that we need to move away from self-orientalizing. We need to move away and address these ideas of appropriation from larger brands, and we need to create our own satellite fashion system that can embrace all our identities, our post-colonial, our colonial, and all our authentic heritage, and bring it into fruition to hopefully be able to compete with the Western, fashion system. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Nada. I'm so reminded of the with the research collective for decoloniality and fashion as well, and just reading the work of Catherine Walsh, and I've just got a quote here. She says, decoloniality does not imply the absence of coloniality, but rather the ongoing serpentine movement towards other possibilities of modes of being, thinking, knowing, sensing, living, that is, and otherwise in plural. And I think the richness of what we're sharing here today, and I'm going to sort of see if anybody would like to respond, is this idea of self-writing, of making much more multiple the archive of knowledge, much more visible the kinds of value structures that support fashioning on the continent, and through the work that you're doing. And so I know we're going to just maybe just have a moment if anybody would like to start with a response to the kind of what the papers have brought up. And I don't know if Lesiba, would you like to respond, or if I give it?
I think let the panel speak first before I do speak.
Absolutely correct. Anybody? Tolu, would you like to come? Yeah, and then Nada.
Yeah, really amazing listening to everyone talking about their research interest and what has brought them to this, junction. One thing that recurred for me as Nkumbu and Benita and Nadia were speaking is this notion that we've been sold a false narrative. And in embarking on this journey, for me personally, on this PhD journey, I'm constantly having this new point of understanding every day, and what I thought that I knew previously and the assumptions that I held, I have to go back and revisit those things. So it's also a process of unlearning those things that you've acquired and you've picked up. So I'm looking at the time, so I'll just
absolutely
let someone
fantastic.
else.
Nada, yeah.
Sorry, really quickly before I go, it's an absolute pleasure listening to all of you. And I just can't so I'm really impressed at how we're all connected and we didn't even know, how connected we actually are. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to create these different archives which are retelling history in a more realistic way and from native accounts. And that's one of the main drivers behind my research, but also behind the collective. And it's that idea of rewriting history from these, very hard to come by accounts of people who were there, and those depictions of reality. So you can present them and contrast them with what has always been presented to us as this fantasy, because it really affects your own identity as a designer, and it affects your own being, because you've been constantly told you're one thing when the reality of it, it's actually completely different. So that archive and that building of authentic sources, I think, is key to any of this working, really. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. I have to go, but thank you so much.
I think the final point I wanted to make was that when we're thinking about emerging fashion, creativity, etc., coming from the continent, what we've got to also realise that there's been so much sort of surrounding in terms of the thoughts of what creativity is, and how for many years it wasn't really considered anything produced from the continent worthy of, elevation, or worthy of being considered truly creative, because it was always considered primitive or slightly this, slightly that. And it's that pushing past that thinking, both in educational establishments, in the fashion industry. We have to move away from there. And that's how we now, through this emergence, through this actually taking our position, means that we no longer feel bound by any of it. That thinking, we need to break those chains of thought, and we are the people to do it.
Benita, I mean, I think really important acknowledgement of the kinds of responsibilities, but it is also quite a burden that you, as Black academics or Black students in the UK, have to carry. That it is your responsibility not only to do just the work of research, but it is to do the work of unlearning and undoing the erasure, the silencing, the disavowal that has come before you. So you're kind of having to do double work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's always been that heavy lifting, as we like to term it. But a point has to be made at some point. And if we want to really consider everyone global, and this is about really having considered thoughts about everything that comes from everywhere, not just, European centered. So that thinking, that global appreciation, and we are not people of colour, the minority, we are the majority actually in the world. So that whole thinking has to really be taken on board, not just by people like me doing this, but by our allies, and that continued development. And it's not something we can just drop, because we want things to get better as we progress.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And just, I'm very aware of the time, so I'm going to just hand it to Nkumbu just briefly, and then we can maybe wrap with some thoughts from Lesiba. But Nkumbu, when you started your research, the exhibition at the V&A hadn't even been imagined, and now it has. And so just that impact of what Benita is kind of pointing to, it's not just that there's been a shift in doing the work by your allies, but actually that there's a broader public demonstration that's changed, and maybe just what has changed about that reception.
I think overall, that specifically, if you talk about the V&A and that exhibition, it's an important step, because it brings into sort of the mainstream at least in the UK, there have been other exhibitions, particularly around textiles, that come from Africa that have been really good. But I think that there's something really powerful about bringing this work from various parts of Africa in various times into that space and having different people interrogate it or look at it, or just have an understanding of the variety. For example, we're talking about like earlier that Africa is not monolithic, and we say that, but a lot of people, when they think in their imaginations about the cultural products, they do still have a very limited view. And I think the importance of events like the specific exhibition at the V&A, as well as other things that are happening around the world, like Nadia's work, for example, her archive or other archives that I've seen developing, is that they're bringing into this conversation the variety, the fullness, the breadth, the difference, the fact that one small corner of one country in Africa is not going to be the same as the other. I'm sure you guys from South Africa can attest to that. You have such a multicultural, multifaceted country just in that small context. And I think what needs to happen even more is more and more people need to highlight or spotlight work that brings into the public space this notion that there is variety. And when people start to see Africa in that way, that yes, we are a continent and there is a communal aspect to that, but we also have, we're not just a flat thing. There's a lot of nuance. And when people engage with that, I think that's the doorway to more change happening in how people view the continent and how they work with it.
Thank you.
I guess for me, I'm just trying to also keep it very short. But I think for me, what sticks out in terms of all the projects, there are multiple themes that are being answered. This ideas of identity, heritage, and political, or sort of how, or Walter Benjamin, I was reading yesterday, the idea of the aestheticization of politicism. So there's a lot of also conversations around this idea of visibility, of African creativity, sort of ideas of design, but also it's about visibility of diaspora, especially in the spaces that you inhabit. And I think that was very important, Nkumbu, that you mentioned that the V&A not only shines a light on, creative practitioners on the African continent, but it also makes, visible the people who actually made that crossover to reside in the spaces outside of the African continent. And I think that's something that's really interesting, something that also kind of expands our notion of Pan-Africanism, and that's maybe something that really, strikes a chord within all of the presentations that have been given today. But I think also what lies at the heart of, all of that we have been saying is this idea of the power of self-definition, self-determination, the idea of redefinitions, and where do our redefinitions come from? And I think that's also a really interesting standpoint to think of, because when we think about modernity, where does the idea of modernity stem from? And it's all good and well to kind of, shift where the axis is located. So fashion axis, the sense of power, but once we're also dealing with, if we're not also dealing with the ideas or the terminologies that we use in addressing those issues of design, creativity, then we find ourselves recreating the same sorts of centers that we're trying to move away from. And I think that's a very concise, I hope, reflection. I would have loved.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Lesiba. Yeah. Tolu, just the last few words, just in reflection. I think there's so much that the complexity of African Fashion Week as it Hi, sorry.
Sorry, okay,
Sorry.
you have to say that again.
I lost you, yes.
Yeah.
I was just reflecting on what Lesiba is saying, what kind of tropes or what kind of definitions does African Fashion Week carry when it moves from one location to another location, and how is that being redefined by a Nigerian exchange? So I think if you want to just
Okay, that's a really nice question. I'm really excited about it, so I'll try to put it within 2 minutes. So when in line with what everyone else has been saying about this notion of Africa being monolithic and being static and being fixed, I initially did my master's on African Fashion Week New York itself. And then I argued about the Pan-African tenets of African Fashion Week New York. But what I soon found was, despite all the celebratory jubilation about, oh, African Fashion Week, African fashion, there were some disagreements in some places where someone wrote a letter and said, oh, well, she was talking specifically to African Americans, that they were appropriating African culture and heritage. And that kind of got me thinking again about the differences in location and spaces. But we've moved beyond, well, I wouldn't say we've moved beyond all that. A point of understanding about identities and spaces is shifted. So what I found with African Fashion Week London is this they're inhabiting multiple spaces. So my focus with African Fashion Week London is then on the Nigerian fashion practitioners, and I'm looking at Nigeria and then the Nigerian diaspora, and then placing Africa Fashion Week London as a transnational space, that brings all these people from different places together. And the complexity of this then is they get to, like, the founder, for example, she's Yoruba, she's from Osun State in Nigeria. And then with the African or Nigerian first ladies from the Yoruba state and the support, it's like, I'm being careful again when it comes to terminologies, not to call them tribes or ethnic groups, because the Nigerian or the Yoruba diaspora is estimated to be over 44 million people worldwide. That is a nation in itself. And unraveling the colonial impact and the colonial history and how this has transformed the Nigerian society and led to the migration of Nigerian and Yoruba people, that's where all these complexities come in. And I'm being careful with my terminologies that I'm using and redefining in some words. And yeah.
And then maybe just to say, I think the complexity of heritage, even the definition of heritage, the complexity of Nigerianness, and then the complexity of it as it moves into different spaces in the diaspora, and to resist and to undo the stereotypes or the lazy labeling that has kind of accrued to so much of fashion that comes from the continent. And maybe that is our work, as Benita says, it is our work that we carry the charge, and Nada with her call to the next generation. It is the work that we are very fortunate to be in this moment where these fashion narratives from the continent are being heard. Spaces are being made available for these narratives to surface. So I think any closing remarks, but I think we are on the hour, and I think we need to wrap up this very important and exciting conversation.
I was just going to say, and I don't know if I'm taking the space of anyone else on the panel who wanted to speak, but I think there's great excitement in where we are right now regarding fashion. I think I started thinking maybe a few days ago around how, you know, this is a nice job that you're doing. You're in a really nice place. You're doing really nice work. You don't have to kind of do like number crunching and stuff. And I think people have to understand that, you know, there's also a pleasure. There's a silent pleasure, or there's a pleasure in being an unfound, terrible individual within whatever academic, within the sort of design world. And I think it's maybe a call for us to continue to do that, if not to be more of it. And I don't know, there isn't any time to kind of ask, but maybe it's really interesting to reflect on that and maybe write on the process of being unconventional, or an outsider within, you know, the fashion sort of space. I think it's important that we're not, you know, looking to find our spaces at the table, rather create our own eating areas, not necessarily a table. So this is the idea of coloniality and even decoloniality. And for me, even to a point where I think whilst decoloniality has become a foundational sort of theory for us to, you know, start thinking from, we are moving away from the idea of decoloniality too. And that becomes then a very Afrocentric idea of I think, freedom to create, to theorize, to think about the work that we are creating.
I think on those really important words, and that there may be joy and that we can continue with the work that we're doing. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you also for the others that had to leave. And thank you, and we will continue the conversations.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Lesiba. Bye.